There's something about the night shift that changes people. When the world sleeps and the hum of life fades to a low vibration, those who stay awake begin to notice things the daylight hides. It starts with small details, a flicker in the corner of your vision, a door that moves an inch more than it should, the sense that someone's walking just behind you though no footsteps follow. You tell yourself it's fatigue, shadows, imagination. But night shifts have rules, unwritten laws whispered among those who have worked them too long. Never look directly at a dark window after 3 a.m. Never respond when someone calls your name from an empty corridor. And if you hear breathing in the place, you're supposed to be alone. Don't breathe back, because there's a reason the world sleeps when it does. Some things are not meant to be seen awake. Tonight, we're going to step into that darkness, into the lives of 10 people who learned that the graveyard hours don't just belong to the living. So turn down the lights, lock your doors. Because the first story comes from Red Hollow Hospital, where one man discovered that sometimes the dead don't rest quietly under fluorescent lights. Red Hollow Hospital never truly slept. Its long, dim hallways stayed alive with the hum of machines, the soft beeping of monitors, and the endless hiss of air vents exhaling stale breath into forgotten rooms. Derek was the night security guard, a job most wouldn't take. The hospital had shut down half its wings years ago after budget cuts, but the board insisted on keeping the lights on and cameras rolling. It wasn't for safety, it was for documentation. He'd begun his shift like every other: coffee, flashlight, and the slow rhythm of rounds that stretched from midnight to dawn. At first, it was routine. The cameras showed nothing but static corridors, pale and silent. The sound of his shoes echoed through floors lined with empty rooms. But at exactly 2:17 a.m., the monitors began to flicker. One by one, the feeds shifted, not glitching, not freezing, but showing something they shouldn't. In Wing C, where no patients had been kept for years, a figure appeared. It moved slowly, half hidden by the grainy gray feed. Head tilted downward, bare feet gliding across the tiles. He stared, waiting for the system to correct itself, for logic to return. But it didn't. The motion sensor light in that hallway turned on real, not digital. The timestamp blinked, confirming it was live. He should have called it in. He should have turned off the screen and stayed behind the desk. Instead, curiosity, that human flaw that always precedes disaster, made him grab his flashlight and key ring. The hospital was colder than usual. The automatic heating shut off after midnight, leaving every corridor damp and still. As he reached Wing C, he noticed something off, the sound of a monitor beeping faintly from somewhere deep inside. But Wing C had been disconnected from power years ago. The hallway stretched in perfect symmetry, white doors on either side, the kind used for patient rooms. Dust covered most handles except one, room 304. The metal there was clean, polished, and the door slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The flashlight beam fell on an empty bed, strap still attached, swinging slightly as if someone had just risen. The beeping grew louder, coming not from a machine, but from an old, unplugged heart monitor sitting in the corner, screen cracked yet somehow alive. And then he noticed the security camera above the door still active, its tiny red light blinking. He checked his radio. Dead. Static. The monitor spiked beep, 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 faster now, like a pulse. And in the reflection of the screen, he saw movement behind him. He turned, but the hallway was empty. The air felt heavy, like the building itself was holding its breath. His flashlight flickered once, twice, and then cut out completely. When light returned, it wasn't his doing. Every door down the corridor had opened, just an inch. From each room came the faint sound of breathing, slow, synchronized, as if something unseen was inhaling through 100 throats at once. He ran, but the building didn't feel like a building anymore. The corridors looped, Every corner led him back to Wing C, to room 304, to that bed swinging slightly as though mocking his escape. On the cameras, hours later, the footage showed him entering the wing and never leaving. His flashlight rolled out into the hall alone at 3:02 a.m., its beam dying slowly until the frame went dark. They found him in the morning near the security desk, eyes open, pupils blown wide, body cold but heart still faintly beating. He didn't speak for 3 days. When he finally did, all he said was, "Don't look at the screens, they watch back." Red Hollow Hospital was shut down completely 2 months later after a fire gutted the lower floors. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but firefighters claimed the smoke alarms never went off, not because they failed, but because they'd all been disconnected that night from the security system. And yet to this day, the emergency lights in Wing C still turn on by themselves, every night at exactly 2:17 a.m. If this story left your pulse unsteady, brace yourself. Because our next tale takes us to a factory where the night shift didn't just guard machines, they guarded the secret of what those machines were really building. Factories are supposed to sound alive, the hum of conveyor belts, the steady rhythm of machines, the occasional hiss of steam escaping from somewhere unseen. But the Northridge assembly plant was silent now. Or rather, it was supposed to be. After midnight, the plant looked like a skeleton, metal ribs arching into darkness, long corridors stretching past production lines that hadn't run since the accident 5 years earlier. The company said it was shut down for restructuring, but someone still had to watch over it. That someone was Evan. He worked alone, logging every patrol, recording temperature readings, and making sure the few remaining systems stayed in sleep mode. The plant still drew power for unknown reasons. He didn't ask why. In old buildings, some systems couldn't be turned off without shutting down others, or so the engineers claimed. His shift began at 10 p.m. sharp. By midnight, the outside world might as well have stopped existing. The factory's walls sealed out sound so completely that even the ticking of his own watch felt amplified, each second a reminder that time still moved, though nothing else did. It was in his 3rd week that he noticed the machines weren't staying off. He kept the main breaker switch locked during rounds, as protocol required, but some nights he'd return to find indicator lights glowing faintly, red, green, and blue, like eyes opening after sleep. At first he thought it was residual power, but one night at 2:41 a.m., the main conveyor belt began to move. It started slow, dragging along the steel rollers with a low metallic groan. Then came the press, a massive hydraulic device that used to shape metal sheets, lowering and rising, though the control board remained dark. No digital readouts, no command inputs, just motion. He tried shutting it down manually, pulling every breaker in sequence. The noise died. The hum stopped. For a moment, he stood in silence, breathing in the oily scent of metal and burnt dust. But when he turned back to his clipboard, he noticed something that froze him completely. The log sheet had changed. Each night he signed off readings and temperatures in blue ink. But below his last entry, in handwriting that wasn't his, new lines had appeared. The entries were older, dates from 5 years ago. Shift incomplete, operator 37 missing. Press malfunction, human obstruction detected. Cleanup incomplete. He stared at the page, the pen marks fresh and damp like they'd just been written. He tore the sheet off, folded it, and slipped it into his jacket pocket. But when he looked up, the overhead lights had shifted from white to a dim orange glow. Someone or something had turned on the emergency lighting system. The plant's silence cracked open like a wound. From deep within the assembly lines came faint, rhythmic sounds, a dragging, a scraping. The conveyor belts shuddered to life again, this time carrying nothing visible but leaving streaks, black, oily smears that weren't oil. Evan followed the motion to the far end of the plant, where the press line connected to the disposal chute. The chute's hatch, a steel mouth sealed by rust, hung open, and from within, a faint tapping echoed upward, irregular like fingers on metal. His flashlight trembled as he aimed it inside. The beam found a helmet crushed inward, wedged between gears, its ID tag still attached. Operator 37, the one from the logs. The realization came too late. The ground beneath his boots vibrated. The conveyor had reversed direction, pulling him backward toward the press. The power was off, the switches untouched, but the machinery moved as if remembering its last command. He broke free, sprinting across the catwalks toward the main control hub. But as he ran, the lights shifted again, flickering between white and red, revealing shadows where there shouldn't be any. Shapes standing motionless between machines. The smell of burnt metal thickened. He reached the control hub and slammed the master power switch. The plant went black. Silence returned. And then came the whisper, not from behind him, not from the intercoms, but from the old wall speakers used for announcements. Cleanup incomplete. The power surged back on. Every light turned crimson. The machine screamed into motion all at once, press arms slamming, gears spinning, belts screeching. And in the chaos, the factory log system on the central computer screen began updating automatically. Operator 72 logged in. Shift ongoing. Material accepted. He tried to log out. His badge wouldn't scan. The system only repeated the same phrase. Cleanup incomplete. The next morning, the replacement guard found the factory dark again. All systems were off, but the clipboard sat neatly on the desk. The top page, dated that night, read: Final log submitted. Operator 72, cleanup complete. No one ever saw Evan again. The board sealed the plant permanently, claiming hazardous contamination. They never explained what that contamination was. But the few who worked there before it closed still remember that smell. Not oil, not metal. Something else. Something burnt. And yet, each year on the anniversary of the shutdown, the power grid still shows a minor surge at 2:41 a.m., exactly when the machines first turned themselves on. If this story made you glance twice at the hum of nearby machinery, hold that thought, because our next one takes you somewhere even lonelier. A diner that never closes. A place where the night shift waitress keeps serving the same man who's been dead for 7 years. There's something unnatural about places that never close. Even when the streets are empty and the world sleeps, the Silver Spoon Diner stayed open, its neon sign buzzing faintly through the fog, the smell of old grease and burnt coffee seeping into the cold night air. Cassie had been the night waitress there for 6 years. She liked the quiet shifts, the few customers who stumbled in after midnight, the truckers who left good tips, the drunk wanderers who mostly wanted warmth and silence. The world after 2 a.m. belonged to people who didn't fit into daylight. She thought she knew them all. Until one night he came back. The man in the dark gray coat, seat by the window, coffee black, no sugar. He'd been one of her regulars, polite, quiet, always watching the rain. But he died 7 years ago on a stretch of highway just outside town. Everyone remembered the accident, a truck overturned, flames lighting up the night sky. Cassie had attended his funeral. So when she saw him sitting there again, head slightly bowed, steam curling from his untouched cup, she didn't scream. She didn't even move. She just froze, coffee pot still in hand, the sound of the diner clock ticking impossibly loud behind her. The jukebox in the corner started playing by itself, the same song that had been stuck in the machine since before she started working there. A warbling old tune, slow and distant. She turned away for a moment, just long enough to tell herself it was stress, lack of sleep, a trick of the mind. But when she turned back, the booth was empty. The coffee was still hot. The cup had a faint ring of condensation on the counter where a hand might have rested. From that night on, he came back. Not every night, just often enough to make her doubt what was real. Sometimes she'd find the coffee already poured before she'd even started her shift. Sometimes she'd glance at the window and see the faint shape of his coat reflected behind her, though the seat was empty. The strangest part was how the air changed when he was near. The diner lights flickered, not with a sudden burst but with a slow, deliberate pulse like breathing. The clock above the counter would lose time, its second hand dragging, and outside the fog grew thicker, pressing against the glass as though listening. Cassie never told anyone. She needed the job, and besides, what could she say? That a ghost wanted coffee, that he tipped in coins dated before she was born. It went on for months. And then one night, something new happened. At 3:14 a.m., the doorbell didn't ring, but the door opened. Cold air swept through. The booth by the window was already occupied before she turned around. Only this time, the man wasn't alone. Across from him sat another figure, a woman. Pale, face obscured by the shadow of her hair, wearing a soaked dress as if she just stepped out of a lake. Cassie's stomach turned. The man looked almost relieved. The woman simply stared at him. Cassie stood frozen, watching from behind the counter. The clock ticked slower, until it stopped completely. The air inside the diner became so still that even the steam from the coffee refused to rise. Then the woman turned her head slowly toward Cassie. Her eyes were wrong. Not dark, not light, just empty, as if whatever had once lived behind them had drowned long ago. The jukebox crackled again, the same broken song repeating. Cassie's knees locked. She wanted to move but couldn't. The two figures sat across from each other, perfectly still, as if caught in some ritual too old to understand. And then together they vanished. No flash, no sound, just gone. The booth was empty, the cups were full. The clock started ticking again. Cassie collapsed against the counter, gasping, her heart hammering so hard she could hear it echo in the stainless steel around her. She thought she was free until she saw it. On the table where they had sat was a check, folded neatly. Written in shaky ink were the words, "Thank you for keeping it warm." The paper was wet, soaked through, though nothing else was. After that night, Cassie quit. She told the owner she was sick, that she needed time off. He didn't argue. He'd seen things too, spoons bending, menus falling from shelves without wind, the smell of lake water lingering in the kitchen after closing. But the diner stayed open. It always did. Truckers passing through the area still stop there sometimes. They say the coffee's strong, the pie's good, and if you come around 3 a.m., you might see someone sitting alone in the window booth, a man in a gray coat, looking out at the fog, waiting. And if you do, don't sit across from him, because the seat opposite is never really empty. If this story made your stomach tight the next time you see an all-night diner's neon glow, you're not alone. Because our next story takes us somewhere far quieter, a graveyard on the outskirts of town, where the man who tends to the dead begins hearing whispers that won't let him leave. Some jobs teach you to stop fearing silence. Others make you realize silence is what hides the worst things. The old Fenwick Cemetery sat on the edge of town, a patch of land that had been expanding quietly for over a century. Rows upon rows of gravestones leaned at odd angles, as if the earth beneath them had shifted too many times. Marcus had been its caretaker for nearly 20 years. The work suited him: solitude, routine, peace. He mowed the grass, cleared leaves, and patched the crumbling stone walls that ringed the property. During the day, the place was calm, even beautiful. But after sunset, when fog began to rise from the ground like breath, the air changed. At first, it was subtle. The smell of soil grew stronger, wet and metallic. The sound of crickets faded earlier than it should. And then came the stillness, the kind that pressed against your chest until you could feel your own heartbeat echoing in the emptiness. Marcus had stopped working nights years ago, but one autumn, after a series of vandalisms, the town council asked him to stay overnight for a few weeks. They promised it would be temporary. He agreed. The first few nights passed quietly. The wind groaned through the oaks, the caretaker's shed glowed faintly from a single lamp, and nothing disturbed the rows of gravestones. But on the fourth night at exactly 3:09 a.m., Marcus woke to a sound. It wasn't loud, just a faint, rhythmic tapping, like fingernails on wood. He thought it might be an animal, maybe a raccoon, until he realized it was coming from under the floorboards of his shed. He froze, listening. The tapping grew louder, slower, almost deliberate. Then silence. When morning came, he checked beneath the shed. Nothing. The soil was undisturbed, the boards intact. But as he knelt, he noticed something strange. The ground was breathing. Not rising and falling like wind moving dirt, but pulsing, as though something beneath it was exhaling. He filled the space with stones and tried to forget. The next night it returned, this time from farther away, from the rows of graves themselves. He stepped outside with his lantern, breath clouding in the cold air. The cemetery stretched out before him, silent, perfect, but the sound came again, a soft, hollow knocking. He turned toward it and froze. One of the coffins had shifted the soil above it, just slightly, as if the earth had swollen from within. He tried to rationalize frost, moisture, air pockets, but then another mound moved, then another. Each sound was distinct, muffled but close, 1,000 tiny hands tapping beneath the surface. Marcus ran back to the shed, slamming the door behind him. The tapping followed. He could hear it moving through the ground, approaching. Then it stopped right outside. The lamp flickered, then died. In the darkness, he heard a voice, not through the air, but through the soil beneath him. A vibration that crawled up through the wood and into his bones. It wasn't speaking words, it was whispering names. He didn't recognize most of them, but then one came that froze his blood, his own. The floor creaked. Something pressed upward from underneath, bending the wood like wet paper. He stumbled backward, knocking over a shelf of tools. For a moment, the shape of a hand, pale, long-fingered, bloated from the earth, pushed through a crack between the planks before vanishing again. By dawn, he was gone. They found the shed door open, the light still burning, the ground beneath the floor dug out in a perfect circle like a shallow pit. Marcus's jacket lay neatly folded beside it. His lantern sat on top. The graveyard was silent again. No sign of struggle, no footprints leading out. Only one thing remained out of place, a new gravestone standing crooked near the back fence. It hadn't been there the day before. No name was carved on it, only a date, the night he vanished. The town replaced him quickly. Another caretaker came, younger this time, cheerful, eager to make a good impression. But after his first night shift, he refused to return. He said he heard whispering beneath the ground. When asked what it said, he didn't answer. He just packed his things and left town before sunset. The cemetery still needs tending, though. Someone always volunteers until the first fog rolls in and they realize the soil there isn't resting. It's waiting. And every year on the same night Marcus disappeared, a faint tapping begins again at 3:09 a.m. Always from beneath the floorboards of the caretaker's shed. Always stopping just before dawn. If this story made you shiver at the thought of what lies quietly beneath your feet, don't exhale yet. Because our next tale rides with a man who spends every night on the road, a courier who begins to realize his deliveries are reaching places that shouldn't exist. The city after midnight has a sound of its own, a hum that seems to come from beneath the streets. It's not quite silence, not quite noise. It's the low vibration of fluorescent lights, the distant echo of wheels on asphalt, the occasional cough of a stranger who shouldn't be there. Evan knew that sound better than anyone. He was a night courier, the invisible kind. He delivered packages that didn't belong in the daylight, unmarked boxes, sealed envelopes, deliveries with no names. He didn't ask questions. Questions made you memorable, and being memorable in this job was dangerous. The shift always began the same way. 11:58 p.m., the courier station on Archer Avenue. A rusted metal door, a short hallway lined with peeling paint, and a dispatcher who never smiled. Tonight, the dispatcher handed him a single brown envelope and said, "Last run, 4B, Harlow Tower." That was strange. Harlow Tower had been condemned for years. Evan hesitated. "You sure about this one?" The dispatcher just looked at him, blank-eyed, like he hadn't heard the question or didn't want to. Then the window shuttered closed. So Evan strapped the envelope into his shoulder bag and went out into the sleeping city. The streets were slick with rain, reflecting the fractured glow of streetlights. As he pedaled through the narrow lanes, he passed boarded shops, empty bus stops, and a flickering sign that read, "Always watching, 24 HR security." The irony didn't escape him. In this city, nobody really watched at night. By the time he reached Harlow Tower, the air had turned colder. The building rose like a hollow monolith against the sky, 30 floors of shattered glass and graffiti scars. The top half was swallowed by mist. He parked his bike by a lamppost that hummed weakly and looked up. There was no light in any of the windows except one. On the fourth floor, room 4B, a single light pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat. He almost turned back, almost, but couriers don't turn back, not if they want to get paid. The front doors groaned open with a dry, splintering sound. Inside, the lobby was covered in dust. His flashlight beam caught faded mailboxes, old posters about rent control, and a dark streak across the floor that looked too much like dried blood. He pressed the elevator button. Nothing. So he took the stairs. The stairwell walls were covered with names and dates written in black marker, years apart, stretching all the way up. Each one stopped at the fourth landing. By the time he reached 4B, the light had stopped flickering. He stood in front of the door, heart pounding. The number 4B had been scratched over so many times it barely looked like letters anymore. He knocked once. No answer. He knocked again. From inside, a faint scraping sound, something dragging across the floor. Then silence. Evan swallowed hard, slid the envelope under the door, and turned to leave. That's when the light flicked back on. It wasn't a normal light. It was that pale, blue-white glow you get from an old CRT screen, the kind that hums faintly. Evan froze. He turned his head just enough to see through the crack in the doorway. The room was filled with old televisions stacked on top of each other, screens flickering static. And in the center of the room, something moved, not walking, but shifting, like static trying to take shape. The air grew cold enough to make his breath visible. A voice came through the static, distorted, layered, as if dozens were speaking at once. "Package received." The door creaked open by itself. Evan stumbled backward. Every instinct told him to run, but his legs wouldn't obey. On one of the screens, his own face appeared live from behind him. The camera angle showed him standing there in the hall, frozen. He turned around. No one there. When he looked back at the screen, the figure behind him was closer now, shadowed, faceless, towering. He bolted down the stairs. His flashlight beam bounced off the walls, catching glimpses of things that weren't there moments ago. Footprints leading up, a handprint smeared on the railing, faint whispering that grew louder with each step. By the time he reached the ground floor, the whispers had turned into distinct words, repeating like a warning. "You delivered it back." He didn't understand, didn't care. He ran outside, jumped on his bike, and didn't stop pedaling until he was miles away. When he got back to the courier office, the door was locked, lights off. No sign of the dispatcher, but taped to the door was another envelope, same type, same handwriting with his name on it. Inside was a small slip of paper with 3 words. Next delivery pending. Below it, a photograph of him standing in front of 4B tonight. He turned the photo over. A date was written on the back. Tomorrow's. That night he didn't sleep. He sat in his small apartment, staring at the clock, waiting for midnight. He told himself he'd quit, tell the dispatcher he was done. But when the clock hit 11:58 p.m., someone knocked on his door. 3 slow knocks. The same rhythm he used at 4B. He opened it, and on the ground was another brown envelope. No name, no return address, just one word written across the seal in black ink. Delivered. If this story made you hesitate before opening your own door tonight, just wait, because the next story drags us even deeper into the world of those who work when the rest of us sleep. Excellent choice, I. Night shifts at the city's security center were supposed to be quiet. That's what made them bearable. Miles liked the quiet, the hum of monitors, the soft static of intercoms, the faint buzz of fluorescent lights overhead. He'd been a CCTV operator for 3 years now, monitoring a grid of nearly 200 cameras across downtown. Car parks, subway corridors, lobbies, empty intersections. Every night looked the same. Until it didn't. It started at 2:37 a.m. Miles was halfway through his thermos of black coffee, eyes glazed over the glowing monitors, when one of the screens flickered just once, like a heartbeat, and then went still. Feed 84, Easton Street Underpass. He tapped the console, thinking it was a connection drop, but the static didn't clear. Then, out of nowhere, the camera refocused, and a figure appeared at the edge of the frame. A tall shape, motionless, blurred slightly by the low-resolution feed. It stood perfectly still, facing the wall. Miles leaned in. There wasn't supposed to be anyone there. That underpass had been sealed off months ago after a gas leak. He zoomed the camera in. The figure didn't move, but as the image sharpened, he realized it wasn't facing the wall. It was facing the camera. And smiling. He tried to radio the field team. Unit 9, I've got movement on Easton Underpass. You got anyone out there? Static. He repeated it, louder, nothing. He switched to the main channel, silence again. It was as if the radio had gone dead, but only for him. He turned back to the screen. The figure was gone. Feed 84 returned to static for a second, then cut to a completely different camera, the rooftop feed of the same building he was sitting in. And standing there by the edge of the roof was the same silhouette. Miles' pulse quickened. He checked the timestamp live. He stared at the image. The figure didn't move, but the feed began to tilt, like the camera itself was slowly being turned. It centered on the dark shape, holding it perfectly in frame. Then the screen cut to black. One by one, other feeds began to flicker: the parking lot, the service tunnel, the subway platform. Each one showed a flash of movement. Sometimes just a shadow, sometimes a half-visible face reflected in glass. Everywhere he looked, the same outline appeared, as if it was moving between cameras. He tried the emergency override. Nothing worked. The monitors weren't responding. It was as though the entire system had been hijacked from inside. The hum of the room changed, deeper, slower, vibrating in his chest. And then one by one, the monitors all displayed the same feed. The control room. His room. From behind. He froze. On the screen, he could see himself sitting at the console, every movement perfectly mirrored. Slowly, he turned to glance over his shoulder, but there was nothing there. When he looked back, the version of himself on the screen wasn't sitting anymore. It was standing. The lights in the room flickered. The air turned heavy, charged like before a thunderstorm. He grabbed his access badge, heading for the door, but when he swiped it, the light stayed red. The system wasn't reading his ID anymore. Behind him, the screens began to stutter frame by frame, each image decaying into distorted static. He could almost make out a whisper beneath the noise, a faint voice buried in the electronic hum. He leaned closer. The whisper wasn't random, it was his name. Over and over. He backed away until his shoulder hit the cold glass wall. His reflection stared back at him from the monitor screens, except the reflection didn't move the same way. It lagged behind by a second, like a delayed feed. Then for one split second, the reflection smiled. He didn't. At 3:11 a.m., all 200 monitors went dark. For 10 seconds, there was absolute silence. No hum, no static, no buzz. Then every screen flicked back on at once, showing a single image. A door, the security control room door, his door. And from the other side, something pressed against it, a shape in the glass window distorted by the camera angle. The shape lifted a hand, pale, long fingers. It knocked slowly 3 times. Thud, thud, thud. Exactly the same rhythm as the sound now, echoing from the real door behind him. Miles didn't turn around. He just stared at the screen, heart hammering, watching as the figure on the monitor leaned closer to the glass, until its face filled the frame. No features, just a blur of static shaped like a person. The door behind him creaked open. Hours later, when the day shift arrived, the control room was empty. The monitors were still on, looping security feeds like normal, except one of the cameras had a new addition. Feed 84, Easton Street Underpass. A tall figure stood motionless in the frame, facing the wall. And this time, it was wearing a security uniform. If this story made you glance twice at the corner of your screen tonight, don't blink yet, because our next story dives into a job even darker than watching the city's ghosts. The morgue didn't have clocks. That was the first thing Thomas noticed when he took the job. Time didn't matter down here. There were no windows, no sunrise, no reminder that the world outside still turned. Only the low hum of refrigeration units, the faint hiss of air vents, and the quiet company of the dead. He'd been the night attendant for 6 months, the invisible shift. When the hospital slept, he worked below it, cataloging the remains that arrived from upstairs. Most nights were uneventful. A few tagged bodies, a few toe tags to double-check. But lately, something had begun to change. The silence didn't sound the same anymore. At first, it was small things. A drawer slightly open when he swore he'd shut it. The sound of a soft click from the refrigeration wall, like metal expanding in the cold. But the air down here didn't expand, it froze. Then came the smell. Not rot, not decay, something else. Like damp stone after rain, old and heavy. He thought maybe the ventilation system was leaking moisture from upstairs. Maintenance said everything was fine. So he told himself he was imagining it. People always said you had to detach in this line of work. Don't think of them as people. Think of them as files, as numbers. That's what Thomas tried to do. But there was one drawer that refused to let him forget. Drawer 47. He never opened it himself. It was already occupied when he joined, one of those long-term unclaimed bodies that nobody talks about. The logbook listed only a tag number and a date, 2/17, no ID. That date hadn't been updated once. And sometimes, when the lights flickered, he could swear he heard the faintest scrape of metal from that drawer. Every morgue has a phone, a landline that connects only to the hospital's internal system. Thomas had used it maybe twice. It rang at odd hours, usually by mistake, static humming between words. But one night at 3:12 a.m., it rang with purpose. The sound jolted through the silence like an alarm. He lifted the receiver. "Pathology," he said, voice low. At first, there was only breathing. Not fast, not panicked, measured, rhythmic, like someone listening. "Who's calling?" More silence. Then a faint click like someone tapping the receiver once against a table. He froze. That sound, it was identical to the click that came from drawer 47. Thomas slowly turned toward the refrigeration wall. Every drawer sat flush and silent except 47. Its handle was slightly tilted, just enough to break the line. The phone hissed softly, static whispering across the line, shaping something almost like words. "Still here?" Then the line went dead. He stood there for a long time, the silence pressing in again. He wanted to laugh it off, tell himself he was hearing interference, maybe a cross line from the ICU. But something in that whisper, that tone, felt deliberate. He set the phone down and stared at drawer 47 until dawn. The next evening, Thomas brought his old cassette recorder from home. He told himself it was for documentation, a safety measure. But deep down, it was something else. Proof that what he was hearing wasn't in his head. He placed it on the desk, pressed record, and went about his routine. Log entry, temperature check, containment inspection. The night passed quietly, nothing unusual. But when he played the tape back the next morning, his stomach turned. Between the faint hum of machines, there were 3 knocks, slow, metallic, then a whisper almost merging with the static. "Thomas." He dropped the recorder. He hadn't given his name on the tape, hadn't spoken it once. He replayed the clip again and again, convincing himself it was a trick of noise. Maybe he'd muttered it without realizing. Maybe it was interference from another device. But every time, the voice came from the same spot, right after the 3rd knock. That night, he avoided drawer 47 completely. He worked faster than usual, eyes fixed on the clock that wasn't there. But around 4 a.m., he noticed something new. The light above the examination table flickered once, then dimmed to a pulse. And from the drawer wall, a faint fog rolled out, like breath in cold air. He approached slowly. One by one, the temperature gauges blinked green, then red. Drawer 47, degrees C. It wasn't supposed to reach 0. He wiped the frost from the handle, staring at the nameplate that bore no name, just that date again. 2/17. He reached for it. Stopped. Backed away. The light stabilized, the hum returned, and for a second, everything felt normal again. But when he turned back to his desk, his recorder was gone. In its place lay a single Polaroid photograph. A picture of the drawer wall. Every handle sealed except one. Drawer 47, half open. After that night, Thomas stopped sleeping properly. He told himself he was imagining it: stress, exhaustion, isolation. He even tried to request a transfer, but HR said his shift couldn't be covered. So he returned, again and again. The morgue had a way of numbing you, like cold air sinking into your bones. He started forgetting small things, which lights he'd turned off, whether he'd eaten. The hum of the refrigeration became constant in his head, even when he went home. And then came the dreams. He dreamed of the drawer walls opening one by one, empty, except for a shadow that moved between them, like something choosing where to hide. Each time, it stopped at 47 and whispered, "Still here." He'd wake up drenched in sweat, the smell of metal in his nose. On his final night, he decided to end it. He came in early, brought a crowbar, and told himself he'd open drawer 47 once and for all, just to prove there was nothing inside but cold air and his own imagination. The morgue felt different that night, colder, quieter. The hum was slower, almost rhythmic, like breathing. He pried at the handle. The metal groaned. Frost cracked along the seam. Then, with one sharp pull, the drawer slid open. It was empty. No body bag, no sheet, no tag. Just the faint outline of where something had been. He laughed, shaky, relieved, almost hysterical. But then, from the far end of the room, he heard a sound that froze him mid-breath. The other drawers were sliding open. One, then another. Then another. Empty all of them until the last one. Inside, something shifted. He took a step forward and saw his own recorder lying there, covered in frost. The tape inside was spinning on its own, playing back a voice. His voice. Pathology, this is Thomas. He stopped breathing. The tape kept rolling. Something's wrong down here, I can hear. Static, then silence. Then another voice, the same one from the phone, whispering between cracks in the sound. Still here. The recorder clicked off. And from behind him, the last drawer shut with a metallic slam. When the morning staff arrived, the morgue was silent. Every drawer sealed. Every log signed off by Thomas. Except one line, scrawled across the final entry page in unsteady handwriting. I finally opened it. There was no trace of him, but the refrigeration temperature for drawer 47 read degrees C, frozen mid-record. And sometimes, when the vents exhale that faint mist, staff swear they can still smell damp stone after rain. If this story made you glance over your shoulder when the room went quiet, wait until you hear what happens to those who clean up after everyone else. The janitor's closet was the smallest room in the entire hospital. And yet, it held more secrets than any other floor. Edward liked that. He wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. The night shift suited him, a man past his 40s, quiet, unnoticed, sweeping the forgotten corners of a place that never truly slept. Hospitals were alive in the day, bright, mechanical, full of footsteps and chatter. But at night, when the lights dimmed and the corridors emptied, it changed. The building exhaled. Pipes groaned softly like bones shifting in old flesh. Edward had learned to move with it. He cleaned the same sections every night, elevators, stairwells, corridors. The rhythm kept him sane. Until one evening when he reached the end of Ward C, a section that had been closed for renovations for over a year. The double doors were sealed with hazard tape. Dust coated the window panels from the inside. But when Edward passed by, his flashlight caught something unusual, a reflection, faint and pale, moving across the other side of the glass. He paused. The reflection wasn't his. He leaned closer. Nothing, just dust and dark. But as he turned to leave, his mop bucket rolled forward on its own, stopping perfectly at the sealed door, as if nudged by a small, invisible push. Every night, Edward kept his keyring clipped to his belt, 43 keys in total, all labeled, all cataloged by habit. But the next morning, when he sat in the break room, he noticed something strange. There was a new key. Small brass, unlabeled. The metal looked older than the rest, the kind that had been handled for decades, smooth from wear. He asked the day shift supervisor if any locks had been replaced recently. The man just shrugged. No new keys, no renovations, no reason to worry. But Edward couldn't ignore it. The key weighed differently, heavier, somehow colder. That night, curiosity got the better of him. He walked toward C again. The sealed door stood silent under the flicker of the emergency light. Dust floated in the air like ash. He tested the handle, locked as always. Then he held up the new key. It fit perfectly. The lock clicked with a deep, metallic sound that didn't belong in this century. The tape across the door tore easily as he pushed it open. Beyond it stretched a corridor lined with empty patient rooms. The air was colder, heavier. Every sound seemed swallowed by distance. He turned on his flashlight. The walls were yellowed, the tiles cracked, medical carts rusting against the walls. Everything smelled faintly of old bleach and something underneath, something damp and human. The sound of dripping echoed from somewhere down the hall. Edward began returning every night. He told himself it was harmless curiosity, that he was just documenting the decay before it was cleaned out. But he stopped telling the supervisors about his rounds. Ward C became his secret. He started noticing patterns. The puddle under room 312 was always fresh, no matter how many times he mopped it. The curtain swayed even when the air was still. Once, he found a file cabinet open, filled with patient charts that ended abruptly, no discharge, no death certificate, just case incomplete. One night he brought a thermos of coffee and stayed longer than usual. Around 3:00 a.m., he felt the temperature drop sharply. His breath misted in the beam of his flashlight. And then he heard it. Footsteps slow, soft. He spun around, nothing. The sound came again, closer now, rhythmic like bare feet on tile. He called out, his voice shaking. Silence answered. He began walking back toward the entrance, but the corridor seemed longer than before, stretching, shifting. The exit sign flickered far ahead, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. When he finally reached the door, the key refused to turn. Something moved at the edge of his light, a shadow detaching itself from another. He turned the key again, hand trembling. The brass felt ice cold, almost burning. The lock gave way with a snap. He stumbled out, slamming the door behind him, breath ragged. When he looked down, the brass key was gone. Edward told no one what had happened, but from that night onward, something followed him. When he mopped the floors in the main corridors, he'd catch glimpses of movement reflected in the wet surface, faint shapes walking past behind him. When he turned, no one was there. The smell from Ward C began to seep into other parts of the hospital. A wet, earthy scent that clung to his clothes, no matter how much detergent he used. He started finding things on his cleaning cart that didn't belong there. Old hospital tools, yellowed gauze, a patient wristband dated 2/17, the same date that appeared in the morgue logs years ago. At first, he thought someone was playing a cruel joke. But then, one night, he returned to his closet and found the brass key sitting on his workbench. He didn't pick it up. He just stared at it, the way it seemed to shimmer faintly in the low light. The air around it vibrated like the hum of a refrigerator. Then he heard it again, footsteps in the hallway, slow, deliberate, approaching. He reached for the door handle to lock himself in, but the door was already locked from the outside. The lights in the closet flickered once, twice, then dimmed to darkness. And in that silence, a whisper slid through the keyhole. Still here. When the morning crew came in, the closet was empty. Edward's cart was parked neatly by the wall, mop rinsed and coiled. The door to Ward C was sealed shut again, hazard tape unbroken. No one could ever find the brass key. But the security logs recorded one strange detail that night. Between 3:00 and 3:06 a.m., the camera feed outside Ward C looped the same 6 seconds. A janitor walking into the corridor with a bucket, and another man following behind him. The second figure had no reflection. If this story made you think twice before unlocking doors after midnight, you should know, not everything that walks in the dark leaves footprints. The yard was dead, not the kind of death that comes from emptiness or neglect, but the kind that breathes, settles into your lungs and waits. Rusted rails stretched in every direction, jagged spikes jutting from cracked concrete. Freight cars leaned against one another like broken soldiers, windows shattered, paint peeling in long strips. The overhead lights buzzed weakly, flickering in rhythms that made your eyes ache if you stared too long. Jonas had been the night watchman here for nearly a year. No one wanted the job. The yard was cursed in more ways than one. The day shift workers claimed to see shadows move between the trains or hear distant whistles when all the engines were cold. But Jonas didn't believe in ghosts, not until the first night he was truly alone. He arrived at 11:30 p.m., gate keys in hand, boots crunching over gravel. The wind carried a cold, metallic tang, rust mixed with something older, sour, almost like iron and rain that never fell. He flicked on the yard lights one by one, and the shadows inside the cars deepened with each buzzing overhead lamp. Everything seemed normal, at least as normal as a dead train yard could feel. Hours passed with nothing but the hum of electricity and the occasional hiss of brakes cooling. Jonas walked the rails with his flashlight, clipboard tucked under his arm, checking for broken ties and loose bolts. It was mindless work, but it kept him awake. Until 2:47 a.m. That's when he heard it, the faint, distant sound of a train rolling along the tracks. The yard was supposed to be abandoned. No engines ran after sundown. The sound was subtle at first, a metallic scrape over gravel, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat beneath the night. Jonas froze, holding his flashlight tight. He turned toward the main track, the one that led out to the abandoned city line. Nothing. He shook his head, convinced it was his imagination. But then the sound grew louder, insistent. A train, moving slowly, arriving without any warning or schedule. He swung the flashlight along the yard. The headlight of an old freight engine pierced the darkness. Its metal gleamed, wet with condensation, though the air was dry. There was no crew, no whistle, no one inside the cab. The train stopped mid-yard as if it had always been there, waiting for him to notice. Jonah's stomach sank. He felt that chill settle in his chest, the kind that makes every nerve stand at attention. He approached, hesitant, each step echoing across the concrete. The engine door was ajar. He shouldn't have looked inside, but he did. Empty. Then he noticed the cars. Each one was lit faintly from inside, flickering bulbs barely visible through shattered windows, and he could see them passengers, not alive, not dead, somewhere in between. Their faces were blurred, frozen mid-expression, eyes wide, mouths open, and they were all staring at him. He stumbled backward, heart hammering. The train hissed and groaned like it was breathing. The lights inside the cars pulsed faintly, casting shadows across the yard that moved against the wind. He wanted to run, but his feet were heavy, rooted to the gravel. The first car's door creaked open. Jonas could see hands pressing against the frame. Pale, motionless, waiting. He blinked and the hands were gone. The door swung shut by itself, though no wind moved the train. Panic took over. He ran toward the yard office, hoping the radio might reach someone, anyone. The line was dead. Every call came back as static. Then he noticed a new sound, footsteps. Slow, synchronized, moving along the rails toward him. But there was no one on the tracks except the train. He turned. The first car's door was open again. He swore the shadows inside shifted, silhouettes leaning forward, reaching out. A cold smell hit him, damp, iron-heavy, like blood long settled into the wood. The footsteps grew louder, closer, though nothing moved toward him in the yard. Jonas tried to climb into the office. The door was locked. His keys weren't on the ring anymore. He pounded on the metal, screaming, but the yard swallowed his shouts. The train's headlights brightened suddenly, almost blinding him. And then the whisper started. Soft, almost melodic, yet unintelligible. A chorus of voices, like hundreds of passengers murmuring together. The sound crawled into his ears, settling into his skull, echoing thoughts he had never spoken. The shadows on the rails moved. They weren't just shadows. He saw glimpses of faces through the train windows, familiar faces. Faces of men and women he had seen in the papers, missing persons long declared dead. And one face, his own. Jonah's breath froze. The image of himself sat among them, staring out from the train car. He blinked, and the train door opened wide. Something that looked like him stepped forward, indistinct, waving him closer. The yard lights flickered violently. Electricity hissed. A sharp metallic screech cut through the air. Jonas felt his feet lift from the ground. Not physically, but in his mind, a tug, a pull, as if invisible hands were dragging him toward the train. He ran, but his steps felt slower, heavier. He made it to the first rail, hands scraping against the gravel. The train moved now, slowly sliding forward, doors opening one by one. Each car revealed more of those pale passengers, all turning toward him, all silent, all waiting. Jonah screamed. The last thing he saw before he fell to the tracks was his reflection in the glass, perfectly mirrored. smiling at him from the window. Then he was swallowed. The next morning, the city's maintenance crew found the yard empty. The rails were quiet, rusted, abandoned as always. The train had vanished without a trace. Not a wheel mark, not a footprint, not a shadow remained. No one knew Jonas had been there. The surveillance cameras had gone dark overnight, only returning footage of a man standing at the edge of the yard, alone, staring at the tracks. Weeks later, new reports came in. The missing persons section of the police database grew. A night watchman reported seeing a strange train in the yard, arriving with nobody aboard, the lights flickering like lanterns in the fog. And some of the descriptions matched Jonah's exactly. People whispered that the train still runs for those who watch too closely, for those who linger too long in dead places, for those who notice what shouldn't exist. And every so often at 2:47 a.m., the yard hums with life. A whistle echoes faintly. Rusted doors creak. And for a fleeting second, the lights inside the abandoned cars glow, revealing passengers who stare outward. And one of them is always looking directly at you. If this story made the hairs on your neck rise, just wait, because the final story is where all these night shift horrors converge into the ultimate nightmare. The hospital never truly slept. Even at 3 a.m., the halls groaned with the weight of fluorescent lights, the faint hum of machinery, and the echo of footsteps that shouldn't exist. Some nights, it was only the janitor or the security guard walking their rounds. Other nights, it felt like the walls themselves breathed, pulsing with life under the guise of inanimate metal and plaster. Evelyn had been called in for the night shift. Not just any shift, the final shift of the month, the one everyone avoided. She didn't ask why. She didn't care. She was tired of excuses, of people leaving unfinished work, of answering to supervisors who never stayed late enough to understand the building's peculiar rhythm. Her flashlight traced the hallways with a steady hand. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something older, earthier, the faint hint of decay. Every shadow seemed alive, crawling along the walls, reaching from corners she hadn't seen before. By 1:17 a.m., she was already aware that something was different tonight. The morgue was quieter than usual. The janitor's closet doors, which normally banged with loose hinges, hung perfectly still. And in the security office, the monitors blinked, but not with images she recognized. Each screen showed empty corridors, empty rooms. Except for brief, impossible flashes. Shadows moving in impossible patterns. Trains she had never seen rolling through hallways. Elevators descending into darkness that shouldn't exist. Evelyn paused at the nurse's station. A chart lay open, its pages blank except for one line scrawled in jagged handwriting. "Do not stay." She froze. Not from fear, curiosity anchored her to the spot. Every instinct screamed to leave, but something pulled her forward. She walked past the elevators and down a hall she didn't recognize. The walls were unfamiliar, yet oddly familiar, like she had passed here before in dreams. At the end of the hall, a door marked maintenance was ajar. She pushed it open. Inside, a corridor stretched further than it should have. Lights flickered overhead. The floor was covered in a thin layer of frost, cold biting at her shoes. There were sounds, whispers, distant metallic clanging, footsteps packing just behind her. She spun around. Nothing. Ahead, a figure stood in the shadows. A man in a janitor's uniform, his back to her. He held a brass key in one hand, swinging it lazily. Evelyn recognized him from the reports, a night shift worker who had vanished years ago. But he moved like a shadow, barely touching the ground. She called out, "Nothing." The figure turned slowly. His face was her own. The key floated upward, twisting in the air, and the corridor behind him opened into an impossible expanse, a rail yard. Rusted tracks stretched endlessly into fog, trains parked in every direction, engines glowing faintly from within. And among the cars were figures she recognized, pale, frozen passengers, some familiar faces from the morgue, the warehouse, the hospital corridors, even security guards she had known. Her heartbeat raced. The man, her own reflection, beckoned. Evelyn ran. She darted through the doors behind her, but the building had changed. Hallways looped back on themselves. Rooms she had never seen were suddenly familiar. Every exit led to another hallway. Every door opened into the same endless corridor, lined with frost and the echo of hundreds of silent footsteps. She stumbled into the morgue. Drawer 47 gleamed in the dim light. The air smelled of damp stone. She knew what she would find, but her mind pushed forward. She opened it. Empty. But the whisper came again, soft, melodic, unmistakable. Still here. Behind her, the lights flickered violently. She turned. The shadow of Jonas, the train yard watchman, stood frozen, his eyes empty but alive with recognition. The ghostly passengers pressed close behind him. The janitor's key floated between them, spinning slowly, humming a sound that resonated inside her skull. Every shadow in the hospital began to shift. Faces she had never seen appeared in the walls, in the floors, in reflections, each one mouthing the same warning, leave. But the exits had vanished. The building was no longer the hospital she had entered. It was a nexus, a place between time and memory, between the living and the dead. Her flashlight flickered. The humming grew louder, a choir of hundreds, then thousands. The rail yard appeared beneath her feet, and she felt herself lifted, suspended above the tracks. Every train moved, doors opening and closing, revealing the same frozen faces. And then she saw herself. Her body stood on the rails, staring at her from inside a freight car. Eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. Around her, the other night shift workers, janitors, security guards, nurses, all trapped in the same loop. The building had claimed them. All who stayed too long, who lingered in the night, were drawn here, forced to become watchers, part of the machinery they had tried to manage. Evelyn fell forward, or perhaps backward, she couldn't tell. Her senses fractured. The humming became a roar. And then she understood. The hospital had always been alive, feeding on the eyes and minds of those who tried to maintain it. The brass key spun faster. The shadows pressed closer. She could feel their cold hands brushing against her skin, pulling, tethering her to the rails. She screamed. The sound was swallowed immediately, replaced by a chorus of silent laughter. The lights dimmed, leaving only the faint glow of the trains. And in the central car, on a seat frozen with frost, sat Evelyn's reflection, the final watchman, trapped, staring outward at anyone foolish enough to notice the yard. Morning came to the world outside. The hospital doors opened as usual. Day shift workers moved through the halls, oblivious. But in the records, a new name appeared in the night shift log. Evelyn, final shift completed. Drawer 47 was sealed. Ward C locked. Security cameras recorded only empty hallways. But at exactly 2:47 a.m. every night, the brass key hums somewhere deep in the building, and the lights in the abandoned corridors flicker. The trains, the shadows, the whispers, all waiting for the next night shift worker to notice. Because the hospital doesn't forgive curiosity, it doesn't forget, and it never lets go. The night never truly ends, and the shadows linger long after the lights fade. If these tales of terror left your heart racing, imagine what the next dark hour might hold. Subscribe now, turn on notifications, and join us, if you dare, for the next journey into the unknown.